We are going to be creating a variety of scripts, and we're going to start with a script that saves our output data into a table variable. Our boss would like us to create a table variable that stores the vendors who spend the most money. They want to see the vendor ID and the vendor name of those vendors, and they only want to see the vendors who have invoice totals greater than 5,000. So we are going to be selecting vendor ID and vendor name from vendors, but to ensure that we're only looking at the vendors who have invoice totals greater than 5,000, we are going to have a subquery in our where clause. So I'm going to pause this just for a minute while I key this in. Okay, so we have selected vendor ID, vendor name from vendors, and in our where clause, it's actually a where in. We are looking at the results of the subquery. So the subquery is going to retrieve the vendor IDs from the invoice table if the invoice total is greater than 5,000. And those are the only vendors that are going to display in our select. So we run this, and whoops, let's run the whole thing. And then you can see the vendor ID and the vendor name. Okay, and it's not all of the vendors that have invoice totals greater than 5,000. It's only the ones that match up to the vendor IDs that are in our vendors table. So when you might have noticed when I ran this by itself, and I did that by highlighting it, there was more than 4 vendors there, although we have vendor 10 listed multiple times. So there are 4. But when we executed like this, you only saw it once. So at this point, we have our select. It's working fine. What we haven't done is store the output in a table variable. So that's what we need to do next. So we're going to declare our table variable right below our use statement. And when you declare a table variable, in parentheses, you have to tell it what the names of the columns are and what the data types of your columns are. So we have vendor ID, which is an integer, and we have vendor name, which is variable character, and that's 50. Now, we still don't have the result of the select going into the table variable. We have to actually modify our select just a little bit by adding an insert at big vendors in front of the select. And by doing that, we're redirecting that output into our big vendors variable. Now, the only problem with storing our data in a table variable is that you really only have access to that data while the script is running. So if we want to see what's in big vendors, we have to do a select. Because if you wait until the script is done, the result of big vendors is gone. Okay, so even though these are separate commands, okay, they're all running at the same time, so we are able to retrieve what's in big vendors. So let's go ahead and run this. And we're going to save this. And we're going to call it chapter 14. Textbook assignment. Now for our next scenario. Let's see, let me move the comment down first. Our boss wants us to print out the maximum invoice amount, minimum invoice amount, and the number of invoices for a given vendor ID. We need to use the AP database and the invoice table. So there's 4 variables that we need to create: max invoice, min invoice, invoice count, and vendor ID. We're going to use AP. We'll do max invoice, which is money, min invoice, which is money. And then on the next line, we'll do invoice count, integer, and at vendor ID variable, which is also an integer. Now we could have done these all on the same line. I just split them up for readability. The next step is to set up our vendor ID variable to the one we want the information retrieved for. So we're going to say set at vendor ID variable equal to vendor number 95. That's the one we want to look up. And now we're going to do our select statement. So the minimum invoice, we are going to set that equal to the min aggregate function, and we're going to get the minimum of invoice total. And then the max invoice variable, we are going to set equal to the max aggregate function of invoice total. And then the invoice count variable, we're going to set that equal to a count of everything. And we do not need a comma. That's our last one. This is all coming from invoices where the vendor ID is equal to our vendor variable. Now, to actually view the data, we have to print out the variables. Okay, because the results of the min, max, and count are going directly into those variables. If I run this, okay, I don't see them. I actually have to use a print statement in order to see the results. So I'm going to print the number of invoices, and we'll concatenate that with convert var at invoice count. And we will concatenate that with a period. So in our print statements, it prints out character. And all of our variables are numeric. So we have to convert them to variable character. And so we're using this convert function. We're telling it what we want to convert it to, and then we're giving it the data we need converted. Now I need to do a couple more of these, and they're all similar. So I'm going to copy and paste and then adjust. So for the second one, it should be the maximum invoice is, and then we should have minimum invoice is. And now instead of converting invoice count, for the maximum, it's going to be max invoice. And for the minimum, it's going to be min invoice. And then that should give me some output so I can actually see what the values are. Okay, and your results should look similar to what I have. And we're going to move our closing comment down and save our changes. So far, we have created a table variable, and then we've created several numeric variables. What we're going to do next is create a global temporary table. Now, when we created our table variable, that value was only available while our query was running. If we tried to print out big vendors now, there would be nothing there. If you use a global temporary table, the value is going to remain during your SSMS session. So after you run the select, you'll be able to access the data. And not only you can access the data, but anybody who is in your group who is logged in will also be able to access the data. So our boss wants us to create a global temporary table that shows unpaid invoice information. Columns in our table should be invoice, hash, date, total, and balance. The data should be retrieved from the invoice table using the invoice number, invoice date, invoice total, and then that calculation that we've been using for balance. So there's a couple different ways that we could create this table. We can use the insert into statements, which is what we've been doing for our final project. And we can create the table from scratch, or we can use the insert into command and pull the data from the invoice table. We can pull that data and put it into our new table. So we're going to be using method 2, where we're taking the data from the invoice table and sticking it into our new table. And so we're going to start with a select. And then we've got our calculation here. Giving that an alias of balance. And we need a couple other aliases as well. So for invoice number, the alias should be invoice hash. Invoice date, it should just be date. Invoice total should just be total. All right, so we're going to select all of that into hash unpaid invoice. So those two hash symbols are going to create this temporary table. This is coming from invoices, where the invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total are greater than 0. And then we're going to go ahead and sort this thing by the balance. And if you remember, when we have a calculation and we have an alias, you can use the alias in an order by, but you cannot in a where clause. So in a where clause, you have to do the actual calculation. Okay, so here is our select, and we're going to go ahead and execute this. Okay, and it has saved the output into the unpaid invoice table. Now, for us to see the results, we're going to move the closing comment down, and we're going to select everything from unpaid invoice. Okay, and you can see that it did pull in our alias and use those for the columns, and it has the data in it.